This presentation is on political and electoral participation and interest among young Canadians.
The basis for the report is the National Youth Survey from 2011 conducted by Elections Canada in preparation for the Canadian federal election. We will be conducting multiple regression analysis in order to analyze youth political and electoral participation and interest as affected by media consumption, Aboriginal self-identification, and level of education.
Preliminary research was conducted to investigate relationships among the variables we have chosen. Homero Gilda-Zuniga's research on social media use suggests there is a positive relationship between social networking sites and political involvement, implying also that social media and internet use may further facilitate aspects of community life beyond political engagement. Moreover, research on Aboriginal peoples revealed that Canadian First Nations groups generally experience lower rates of voter turnout. Harrell, Panagos, and Matthews' research for Elections Canada shows that various factors, including language group membership, involvement in Aboriginal organizations, and perceptions and attitudes toward the Canadian state, all affect the prevalence of Aboriginal involvement in the Canadian political system.
Our dependent variable is political and electoral participation and interest among young Canadians. It is an index constructed from the following variables. Thinking about all elections since you have been eligible to vote, would you say you have voted in none of them, some of them, most of them, or all of them? Did you vote in the last federal election held on May 2nd? Overall, how interested were you in this last federal election? And to what extent would you say you are interested in Canadian politics? The variables in this index were recoded to ensure political and electoral participation and interest were conveyed through the highest values. The alpha score for the index was 0.7576, meaning that the variables are sufficiently related and can be combined into an index.
Our first independent variable is media consumption as measured by number of hours per day spent on the internet. Our second independent variable is Aboriginal self-identification. Our third independent variable is level of education. In building on the research previously mentioned, the following hypotheses were made. First, that an increase in media consumption will result in an increased political and electoral interest and involvement. With social media playing an important role in forming information networks, young Canadians who are active on the internet will have access to more political information. Second, self-identifying as Aboriginal will result in a decrease in political and electoral interest and participation. The rationale here is that Aboriginal people face socioeconomic disadvantages, which other groups do not. Third, that a higher level of education will mark an increase in political and electoral interest and participation.
Upon running a multiple regression analysis of the effect of the three independent variables on the dependent variable, there are a few important points to note. First, the significance of the equation as a whole, as indicated by an F-score of 0.0000, shows that the findings are not likely due to chance. Moreover, all three individual t-tests produce values below the 0.05 threshold. Looking at each independent variable individually, the b-values indicate results in line with our hypotheses. Both media consumption and level of education positively impact political and electoral participation and interest, while Aboriginal identification marks a decrease in the dependent variable. Moreover, the standardized regression coefficients show that when controlling for the other variables, level of education has a greater influence on participation and interest in Canadian politics, as indicated by a beta score of 0.314. Media with a beta score of 0.066 and Aboriginal identification at negative 0.108 do not exert as high an influence on the dependent variable. These three variables together explain 13% of variance in the dependent variable, as indicated by an adjusted R-square value of 0.134. Thus, while not explaining as much variance in the dependent variable as we would have hoped, out of these three variables, level of education emerged as a relatively strong predictor of young Canadians' interest and involvement in politics. The final point to note is that multicollinearity was avoided in this analysis, with tolerance scores of 0.995, 0.935, and 0.936, respectively illustrating that the variables were never measuring the same thing.
In seeking further understanding of variance in young Canadians' interest and involvement in politics, we decided to conduct a hierarchical regression to control for engagement in volunteer work. In doing so, two new hypotheses emerged. First, that engaging in volunteer work will result in an increase in political interest and involvement, and second, that controlling for this variable will lead to increased explanation of variance in the dependent variable. Our control variable was recoded into a dichotomous dummy variable, with respondents answering yes to engagement in volunteer work scored as 1, and no scored as 0. The equation remained significant once volunteer work was controlled for. In terms of the first hypothesis, the results show that volunteering did indeed positively impact political interest and involvement among young Canadians. The b-value demonstrated a 3/4 unit increase in the dependent variable, with a beta score of 0.143, placing volunteer work as the second best predictor of variance among the independent variables.
The findings of our hierarchical regression analysis point not to the elaboration we were expecting, but rather replication of our primary results. In examining our findings and applying the rule of thirds, the original relationship did not change by 1/3 or more of its original value, and therefore the results have simply been replicated. The adjusted R-square moved up to 0.153, meaning explained variances rose to 15% with the addition of the control variable. The findings are a clear example of replication. Whether or not respondents volunteered did not affect the impact media consumption, Aboriginal self-identification, or level of education had on the dependent variable. The measures of standard error, b-values, beta values, and tolerance all remain similar to our first regression example.
To summarize our findings, our 3 original hypotheses were confirmed in the first multiple regression analysis. Upon adding a control variable to try to come to a better understanding of variance in the dependent variable, we discovered another solid predictor of variance, but did not create a model of elaboration like we had hoped. Conclusions that can be drawn from this study are broad. The relationship between Aboriginal self-identification and political and electoral interest and involvement, as well as education and political and electoral interest and involvement, is fairly straightforward. Media consumption through internet use was not as strong a predictor as preliminary research suggested. We inferred that due to widespread internet use in the demographic chosen for the survey, i.e. Canadians aged 18 to 34, the dataset did not produce a wide distribution of responses for this variable. If looking at a survey of Canadians of a wider age range, we feel that the effect of media consumption on interest and involvement in politics would be more accurately portrayed in the results. Young Canadians are routinely portrayed as the most disaffected and disinterested group in terms of political and electoral interest and participation. Thus, it is important to understand ways in which young Canadians can become more interested and involved in order to strengthen Canadian democracy. Further research into this topic must be predicated on different indicators making up the dependent variable that do not focus solely on institutional involvement, but rather include organizational and community involvement activities, such as organizing protests and signing petitions, to gain a better picture of young Canadians' relationship with politics.